Hello, welcome to the LaRouche Pack Weekly Report for May the 2nd, 2012. I'm John Hofel, and with me in the studio today are Cody Jones and Ben Dennison of The Basement and Lyndon LaRouche.
Okay, so I'll just open up by first starting to situate people with where we are politically. It's, despite the lies that are coming from Obama, that are coming from the mass media, among the elite, so to speak, the oligarchy, there is a very clear recognition that the financial system has come to a dead end, that the thing is collapsing. And they're moving to implement systems that would appropriately put them in a position to then sort of emerge out of the ashes of this dying system, still in control, but in control in a way which is even more genocidal than the current system that we have. I mean, if you just look at what's occurring in Europe with, it was just announced, the downgrade of these 11 banks in Spain, which really it's just the most recent manifestation of what we've been seeing as an ongoing sort of domino effect collapse of nations across the European continent, which then is coinciding with these moves to implement this European stability mechanism, which effectively is to do to Europe what the oligarchy's been doing to the so-called developing world and the third world for the last 40 years, which to effectively force them into taking these large loans, and then in exchange for these loans to say that, well, if you're going to get the loan, which we're forcing you to take, you now have to implement all these kinds of austerity measures. Cuts to social services, cuts to employment, just cut. Things which ultimately serve the purpose of population reduction, which is really the name of the game here. Now in that vein, you've got the release of upcoming release of a number of reports from some of the leading think tanks or leading institutions of the oligarchy, namely the Royal Society as well as the Club of Rome. Now, the Club of Rome, as people may remember, they are the ones responsible for 40 years ago putting out the Limits to Growth book, the Limits to Growth policy, which was the idea that population is growing at an unsustainable rate, industry is growing at an unsustainable rate, and if we don't quickly move to implement constraints on industry, on population, on development, then we're going to have this continued explosion of population, we're going to overrun our resources, and we're going to run into this mass calamity and mass death. Now, here they're coming back saying, look, everything that we said should be done wasn't done, which is actually a lie, because in fact much of what they called for was done. But now they're saying we were completely right about what we had forecast would be the nature of the situation. We've got unemployment, we've got poverty, we've got starvation, we've got all these crises. Now it's time to really more forcefully move with our policy. And so they're putting out on May 7th, they're going to release what they're calling their 2052 report, which is the next 40 years, which is basically a call to arms to really just move forcefully with the implementation of this green policy, the policy of zero growth, the policy of no technology, a no development policy, which ultimately the aim is to get population reduction. I mean, I think this was most clearly stated by Paul Ehrlich in the last couple weeks, where he gave interviews saying, look, we've got to limit and reduce the population down to between 1.5 and 2 billion people. That is the sustainable population of this planet. Now that becomes particularly relevant in the fact that Paul Ehrlich is someone who the current science advisor to the president, John Holdren, had co-authored a number of articles with. And John Holdren was someone who in the 70s had co-authored a particular, I think it was a book or an essay with Ehrlich, that called for actually putting in chemicals into the drinking water to sterilize people. Now, he then came back in his confirmation saying, well, I don't necessarily believe in that anymore. But as recently as 95, he penned another article with Ehrlich, where again he said, we've got to move for zero growth and population limitation. That's the policy of the science advisor of our president, an anti-science, anti-population policy. So that's the direction that the oligarchy is moving. They're saying, okay, on the one hand, there's all the lies in the mainstream media about everything's fine, we're moving towards a recovery. But among sort of the elite think tanks, they're operating from the standpoint of, okay, let's acknowledge the surface reality. You know, for example, in this upcoming in the report that the Royal Society put out, here's what they identify as the crises facing the world today: unemployment crisis, a food crisis, a global financial crisis, an economic crisis, and a global ecological crisis. So they acknowledge the same kinds of crises which you had been forecasting for really the 40 years since they first put this policy in operation. They're now forced to acknowledge it, but then their solution is actually a more forceful implementation of exactly the policies that created the crisis, which they're now saying is here. That you see the kind of sophistry, as we'll demonstrate and get into. We would have completely avoided this kind of crisis had we at the time, say, coming out of the assassination of Roosevelt, or had we moved with, whenever you had forecast the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, quickly move with a full-blown industrial policy, full-blown nuclear economy, the space program. All of the problems they're identifying now would be non-existent, and in fact, we'd be in a very thriving, growing situation. And in fact, today, the solution to the crises they're now identifying would be the immediate implementation of things like NWAPA. You want employment, you want to deal with controlling weather systems, you want to deal with the financial crisis, go with Glass-Steagall, go with the credit system, go with NWAPA. But of course, their intention is never to go with that. Now, I just want to draw the point out that what you're seeing from these guys is not something new. That, in fact, this has been the policy, this has been the mentality of the oligarchy from the beginning, so to speak. And just to give you a sense of that, I'm going to read a short quote from a poem from the 6th century BC called Cypria, which discusses the mentality of Zeus. It says, "There was a time when the countless tribes of men, though wide dispersed, oppressed the surface of the deep-bosomed earth. And Zeus saw it and had pity, and in his wise heart resolved to relieve the all-nurturing earth of men by causing the great struggle of the Ilian war. Then the load of death might empty the world. And so the heroes were slain in Troy, and the plan of Zeus came to pass." And so you see, that was, from the beginning, that was the policy of the oligarchy. That was really what Zeus represented, an anti-human, anti-population policy. That this idea of Mother Earth as the thing which takes precedent has been there from the beginning of the oligarchical system. Zeus was a greenie. Zeus was the first environmentalist and the first genocidalist. Now, that same mentality is what you see carried forward into the likes of people like Bertrand Russell, right? Who, once he wasn't able to get mass extinction through thermonuclear war, because the Russians developed the bomb before he could get his policy of preemptive nuclear strike, he then started pushing policies of population control, policies of, he's the guy who said if a Black Death could come along once in every generation, people could then procreate freely, and there'd be, and the suffering that would occur as a result, we think nothing of it. Right? That's Bertrand Russell, who himself, his grandfather, was the guy who was the main supporter of the Confederacy, right, out of England, out of Britain. So that's what you're dealing with the oligarchical system. Now, the sophistry has sort of developed since then, and just to give just a slightly sharper picture on some of this history, a fellow we've been looking at recently, this guy Arthur Tansley, who actually was a disciple of Bertrand Russell's, and who was the one who first coined the term ecosystem. And he coined the term ecosystem based off of what he claimed as an insight that he gained from a discussion with Freud, Sigmund Freud, about the nature of the human mind as being like a machine, an electronic machine. He then extended that to say, well, actually, the entire earth, all the living things on the earth, can actually be modeled and understood as like an electronic machine, a mathematical system. And so he developed this idea of ecosystems. He then became a close collaborator with Julian Huxley, and they together created the ecological movement coming out of World War II. Now, this is the same Julian Huxley who in his founding of UNESCO, actually said that, well, ideas like eugenics have sort of fallen out of favor because of the Nazis, who they supported. So it's going to take some time, but eventually we can slowly get people to accept and adopt these ideas of eugenics and population control. And that's really the core, the heart of the environmentalist movement, of the ecology movement. Has become the adopted policy, the adopted strategy of the oligarchy to induce people to accept this idea that man is inherently a destructive force, that really the most serene thing is nature, and that if nature had its way, if nature were allowed to do what it wanted to do without man interfering, it would tend to move towards this perfect balance, this perfect equilibrium. Hence Al Gore's Earth in the Balance. And so what they've done is then all the models that they use to try to model the future of the planet, the future of humanity, are all based on thermodynamics, systems analysis, and the idea that ultimately all systems want to move naturally towards this equilibrium state. And so anything that interferes with the move towards that equilibrium state or throws that off, they say is bad. Which means inherently technology is bad, population growth is bad, humanity is bad. And that's really the policy that they have. Control man, bestialize man, cull the herd, keep a small limited number that they as the elite can roll over. And in effect, you convince the population to accept and want that policy because that's actually what's in the best interest of the planet. Now, contrary to this is actually what we've been discovering and developing, which is that the actual natural tendency, the natural directionality of life, of the biosphere, is not towards an equilibrium state. It's always towards an increase in disequilibrium. That's always, and not just an arbitrary disequilibrium, but a directionality towards growth, towards complexity, towards an increase in energy flux density of the system. That the system as a whole is a developing, growing, creative system. That the characteristic of the creative mind is the characteristic which governs the biosphere and actually the universe as a whole. Now, just to point out some aspects of this, we have here the diagram, which we've been using a lot lately, which is a heuristic which depicts the kind of growth function which embodies the characteristic of the biosphere as a whole. That if you look at the system as a whole, it's always moved towards growth. Now, what you see with the growing of the cones is what you could consider as an increase of energy flux density. That in terms of per, say, unit area or unit of time, the amount of energy, or it might be material in terms of biogenic migration of material, per unit, the amount that's flowing through that cross-section of area is constantly increasing. Now, it's increasing not just simply as a linear process, but it's increasing as a function of a constant introduction of new, in effect, technologies into the biosphere. New forms of life come into the biosphere, which are more energetic, more capable of transforming nature. The relationships among different types of species or between different kingdoms of life become more connected, more dynamic. And so the trend has always been one which is, though it's been in a sense a certain kind of linear increase in energy flux density, a growing increase of energy flux density, it's been a function of these nonlinear jumps, these transfinite jumps that are a function of the introduction of the equivalent of biological technologies into the system. Punctuated then by, as we've discussed, these various mass extinction points. But the mass extinctions just represent a transition point, moving out of the old system, which no longer was capable of continuing the growth function, and into the new system, which was then able to continue the process of anti-entropic development. So that's the actual nature of the biosphere. It never goes towards equilibrium. It's always going out of equilibrium into a state of change, direction. Now, this is precisely generally the kind of function that we see in human economy when we think about healthy human economy. Here we've got an image of sort of the development of different types of power sources over the last 400,000 years or so, 500,000 years, where we move from coal to wood, then coal to petroleum, petroleum to nuclear. After nuclear, we then have the potential to go into thermonuclear and ultimately matter-antimatter. The effect of this has always been similar to what we've seen in the biosphere: an increase in overall energy flux density, an increase of the power of man to transform the world around him, to support more people at ever-increasing higher standards of living, and to actually create the ability for creativity, the source of those changes itself, to become more powerful. So in effect, you have a function where creativity is creating the conditions for its own self-development to a more powerful state. Really, it's creativity for itself, so to speak. And you see it's something where as time progresses, this is somewhat to scale, as time progresses, the rate at which these new technologies, these transformations are introduced is constantly increasing. So you have a constant rate of increase of the density of these transformations, with each transformation leading us into a completely new transfinite domain of power of man in the universe, which is the lawful system, right? This reflects, to an extent, what we've seen already in the biosphere, but with some fundamental differences in the sense that this is something which is one species, sort of the super species, mankind, doing it as a willful process.
Well, let's look at the thing from a reverse standpoint. We've now defined one. We're looking at this thing, first of all, from the standpoint of the history of Earth, the biological, biogenic history of Earth.
Right.
We are assuming that the existence of the universe, if we think sloppily, we're thinking that the universe is worked from the inside of the Earth, or from the inside then of the solar system, which is sort of a middle ground. But then, this curious thing, the universe is older than the Earth. So the processes which developed on Earth are important, but they don't give us an absolute basis for judgment of what the hell's going on. And I do use what the hell advisedly. All right, so therefore we assume that our experience from the inside of Earth and its history as known to us, and I mean the physical history, not just the biological one, that's the rule. Well, it is, in a sense, it's a truthful record from a scientific standpoint of a phase space. Because the solar system, like the Earth, is only a phase space inside this galaxy. And the galaxy, in turn, is a part of a supergalactic process. Now, how can we say that we're living assume that we're living in a blank area within which Earth somehow was imagined to exist,
Right.
when we know that before Earth existed, the galaxy existed? And before the galaxy existed, their supergalaxy process existed. So therefore, how do we reconcile these things with our idea of time? So therefore, what we have to look at and say, what is the universal process? If we try to define from our experience with Earth and Earth experiences, and actually to some degree the solar system now, if we try to imagine that somehow the universe implicitly came into existence as a result of the existence of the planetary system, and that life and so forth, the power which life represents as a genetic force, was something which already existed. So now you come up to the great problem. How do you try to explain everything that Zeus or some other creature like that started the whole system on Earth all by his lonesome, when the fact is that the processes on which the generation of humanity inside the solar system depended based on things which are larger than, on a larger scale, and older. Then you get in within our galaxy system, which is a very complex system. You have a phenomenon like the Crab Nebula.
Yeah.
And the Crab Nebula is a higher order form which came known to us in actual human record time.
Right.
So therefore we have to say that we are actually responding to a predetermined set of rules in the universe. And what we are trying to understand is what those universal rules are. Now, the problem we have with all these creeps, like the oligarchical types, these lower species types that are running the planet today, What we are failing to do is to try to understand what the system is which created us, created the solar system, and also created the galaxy. So because the rules that run us are actually on that scale. We say these tend toward universal rules. Mm-hmm. Now, what we know on Earth is three things. Well, three different phases, which are known phases. The animal, or the inert, the animal, and then the human. All right. Well, those are valid things because we can adduce within this framework. But this framework has to live within a larger system. So the larger system already implicitly contains the groundwork which produces the Earth system and the human system. And what our job is to try to understand this and what the meaning of the existence of man is. Mankind is existing within the solar system and confined within, in terms of the galactic system. We have to open our minds to understand what life is, what human life is. So there's an intention, of what we would call an intention, inherent in the whole system. And we as human beings are not going to discover the secret of that whole system overnight. Right. We can get an intimation of that, but not that. But we have to think about the fact because Earth is in danger now, going into this particular part of the phase of the galaxy. We're coming at risk because we have no proof that the human species could outlive the kinds of terms we're living in today, unless we can change some of the characteristics of this process, new defenses of mankind, that sort of thing. The first thing that stands before us is, well, let's look at the case of Mars. Or the events of Earth is a good one to start with, but take Mars. Okay, if we as mankind are going to think scientifically, the first target before us now is Mars, because it's going to take a good deal of development on our part to go to a matter-antimatter system, which is what we really need to have in order to situate this problem of Mars. We cannot handle this thing. We can do things to Mars, but we cannot make Mars controllable by us as a system for our existence unless we go actually into the realm of matter-antimatter reactions. When you just think about a change in Mars for us means we've got to deal with the solar system. You cannot change Mars effectively the way we have to change it, if just within the context of Mars or even the solar system.
Yeah, right.
So you have to think in terms, because in order to change Mars, you've got to think of the creative force that developed this solar system.
Right.
And it's a solar systemic change that you're imposing upon this thing. You can make adjustments, try to plant things there and do things like that. Mm-hmm. But to change Mars in the way humanity needs to have it change it, you have to go it from a galactic standpoint. Other developments indicate that the galaxy is the frame of reference on which we have to act.
Right.
The Crab Nebula is a typification of the level of approach on which we have to act. Mm-hmm. Now, we're not going to do that in our lifetime.
Right.
But we have to move in the direction which means that our descendants are moving in that direction. We have to have these kinds of objectives within, what can we do within this generation, this century? What can we do in the next century as well? What about 1,000 years?
Right.
What can we do in 1,000 years?
Right.
And if we don't think in those terms of reference, we as mankind are not going to be able to determine the existence of our species for the future. So therefore we have before us in exactly the opposite to what these creeps, the oligarchs, think. We've got to move in precisely that mission orientation. And therefore we've got to start thinking in terms of human beings as progress of what we call science today, science and related matters of culture. Mankind, the leadership of mankind must come from people who think in these kinds of terms. Because we must induce the human species to recognize that the continued existence of the human species depends upon actions which depend upon thinking in this direction.